The substitute, the sound. The sound lasted less than 2 seconds. That is the first thing you need to understand. Less than 2 seconds of fabric giving way under deliberate force. A sound that if you heard it out of context on a street in a parking lot anywhere else in the world, you might not even register. Might not turn your head, might keep walking. But in a gymnasium filled with 400 people in the kind of absolute silence that only happens when a crowd collectively stops breathing, that sound carried all the way to the back wall and came back again. And then came the laughter. Not from everyone, not even from most, but from enough. The kind of laughter that happens when young men who have never been told no suddenly realize that once again there are no consequences. The kind of laughter that has been rehearsed in a way. Practiced, expected. She did not run. She did not cry. She stood exactly where she was in the center of that gymnasium floor, with the torn fabric of her blouse hanging open and every set of eyes in that room on her body, and she did not move a single inch. And that stillness was the moment everything changed. But you cannot understand what happened in that gymnasium on the morning of September 28th without understanding who was actually standing there, without understanding what had brought her to that school, to that town, to that exact moment, without understanding the 4 weeks of quiet, methodical, invisible work that preceded those 2 seconds of sound. So let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning. Part 1. The woman in the room. The parking lot at Westfield Academy looked like 100 other school parking lots in the American South at 7:15 in the morning. Pickup trucks, SUVs, a row of faculty vehicles near the main entrance, most of them practical, most of them aging. The kind of vehicles that belong to people who chose a profession for reasons other than money. The mist was still sitting low over the practice fields when she pulled in. A Toyota Camry 7 years old, a small dent above the rear passenger door that had never been fixed. She parked in the far corner of the lot, not because there were no closer spaces, but because the far corner gave her a clear line of sight to both the main entrance and the side door near the gymnasium. She did not decide this in the parking lot. She had already decided it 3 days before she arrived, when she had studied the school's floor plan with the same attention she had once given to appellate case law. Her name for the purposes of Westfield Academy's substitute teacher roster was Claire Donovan. That part was true. She was 24 years old. She had graduated from Harvard Law School the previous spring, summa cum laude, and she had a job offer waiting at one of the most respected civil rights law firms in Washington, D.C., an offer she had deferred once already and would defer again if necessary. She was wearing a blouse she had bought specifically for this assignment, modest, professional, slightly wrinkled in the way that suggested a woman who was trying her best and didn't quite have everything figured out. The bag over her shoulder was a student's bag, not a lawyer's bag. There was a lesson planner in it. There were also 3 concealed recording devices, a biometric monitoring unit the size of a small button, and a phone equipped with military-grade encryption that could transmit live audio and video to a federal secure server with a single tap. She walked toward the main entrance like someone who was slightly nervous about her first week on the job. She was not nervous. She was watching. Charlotte's East Side had changed over the decades the way most American cities change in layers, each generation building on top of the previous one, sometimes improving things, sometimes just covering them up. Westfield Academy sat in one of those transitional neighborhoods, a place caught between what it had been and what it was trying to become. The school itself was newer than the neighborhood suggested. Charter schools had come to North Carolina in waves, each one promising something the public system couldn't deliver. Smaller classes, more flexibility, more attention paid to each individual child. Westfield had opened 11 years ago on exactly those promises, and for the first few years, it had delivered on most of them. The families who sent their children here were not wealthy families. They were families who worked. Electricians, nurses, logistics workers, people who drove 40 minutes each way to jobs that paid enough to keep the lights on but not enough to save anything. They had chosen Westfield because they believed in it, because a recruiter had sat across from them at a kitchen table and told them that their child deserved better, and they had believed him. A lot of them still believed him. That was the most important thing to understand about Westfield Academy. It was not a bad school by accident. It was not a corrupt institution that everyone recognized as corrupt. From the outside and from the inside, if you didn't know where to look, it looked like exactly what it claimed to be. Test scores were respectable. The building was clean. The administration gave the right speeches at the right assemblies. But there is a version of institutional failure that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't arrive with sirens and obvious villains. It arrives slowly over years through a series of small decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. A complaint set aside because it's inconvenient. A pattern ignored because acknowledging it would be expensive. A victim discouraged from pursuing her case because the case would embarrass people who needed to remain unembarrassed. And at the center of all of it, almost always, there is a man who is very good at something valuable and who has learned that being very good at something valuable makes him nearly untouchable. At Westfield Academy, that man was Warren Grayson. There are men who build loyalty through fear, and there are men who build it through results. Warren Grayson had built his through results, and that made him far more dangerous than a man who ruled through fear alone. He had arrived at Westfield 8 years ago from a head coaching position in Memphis, Tennessee, a position he had left under circumstances that, if you dug into them, raised questions. Questions that had been answered quietly at the administrative level by people who understood that the most efficient solution to an inconvenient problem is often a clean transfer and a sealed file. He brought with him a reputation as a football coach who won. Within 3 years, he had turned Westfield's team from a program that hadn't posted a winning record in 5 seasons into a program competing for a state championship. Within 5 years, they had won 1, then 2, then 3 in a row. This matters. Not because the football was important, though people at Westfield had begun to believe it was the most important thing, but because winning 3 consecutive state championships in North Carolina high school football is the achievement that insulates a man from almost any scrutiny. It means boosters. It means donors. It means board members who look the other way because looking the other way is easier than dismantling something that wins. Warren Grayson knew the name of every one of his 47 players. He attended their graduation ceremonies. He made phone calls on their behalf to college coaches across the country. He could tell you without checking any notes the GPA of every starter on his roster and what their parents did for work. He was not a simple man. He was not a stupid man. He had simply decided somewhere along the way, maybe in Memphis, maybe before Memphis, maybe in some moment, so gradual he couldn't even locate it himself, that the rules applied to other people. That results earned exemption. That loyalty, once established, was its own form of justice. He walked the hallways of Westfield Academy the way men walk when they have never once doubted that the hallway belongs to them. Teachers moved slightly when he passed, not because he asked them to, because it had become a habit for 7 years to give Warren Grayson the center of any room he entered. Claire Donovan noticed this on her first morning. She filed it away and said nothing. Tyler Grayson was 17 years old and 6 feet 2 inches tall, and he had his father's eyes, the same sharp assessing quality, the same capacity for reading a room in seconds. He was the starting quarterback for a program that had won 3 state championships, and he moved through Westfield Academy accordingly. He was not, to be precise, what most people picture when they picture a bully. Bullies in the common imagination are crude. They are obvious. They escalate because they don't know any better. Tyler Grayson had been raised by a man who understood power and strategy, and those lessons had settled into him the way good coaching always does, invisibly, completely, until they became instinct. He did not threaten people directly. He created situations. He did not embarrass people clumsily. He established contexts in which embarrassment became almost inevitable, and then he watched, and the watching was the point. The watching said, I can do this anytime I want. I can do this because no one will stop me. And the fact that no one has stopped me yet is itself the message. 4 substitute teachers in the previous 12 months had lasted less than 2 weeks at Westfield Academy. Their resignation letters, carefully reviewed as part of the federal file that had been building for 8 months, all used the same language. Difficulty managing classroom dynamics. Not the right fit for this particular school community. A mutual understanding that the placement wasn't working out. Not one of them had filed a formal complaint. 2 of them had been encouraged not to in conversations with Principal Sandra Voss that had been friendly in tone and unambiguous in content. Tyler Grayson walked into first period homeroom on Claire's first morning, 3 minutes late, without apology, and took his seat at the front of the room the way a man takes a seat at a table he owns. The room shifted when he entered, just slightly, the way a room shifts when the person everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. He looked at Claire for a moment. Then he said pleasantly that he really liked how she'd already organized the attendance sheet. Very professional, very on top of it. The class laughed softly. Claire looked at him without expression and continued taking attendance. She thought, this is a 17-year-old who has learned to disguise aggression as charm. He has done this many times. He is very good at it. He will continue the same approach with minor variations for as long as it produces results. She thought he has never met anyone who didn't give him a result. She continued down the roster. At the back of the room, in the second to last seat by the window, there was a girl who did not lift her head for the entire first period. Her name was Lily Caldwell. She was 16 years old. Her file, which Claire had memorized before walking through the school's front doors, described her as a junior with above-average grades who had transferred into Westfield 2 years earlier. What the file did not include, because it had been removed from the official record, was the complaint she had submitted 14 months ago. She had written it by hand, in careful, deliberate cursive, the hand of someone who understood that what they were doing was serious. She had described 3 specific incidents. She had given dates times names of witnesses. She had brought it to Principal Voss herself on a Tuesday afternoon after school. The response she received was documented in a separate file, the federal file. Principal Voss had thanked her for coming forward, had expressed concern, had suggested that these kinds of situations were often more complicated than they appeared, had encouraged Lily to consider whether the incidents she described might have been misunderstandings rather than deliberate acts, had pointed out gently that the students involved were good students from good families, and that accusations of this kind could have consequences for everyone involved, including the person making the accusation. 14 months later, Lily Caldwell sat at the back of first period homeroom and did not lift her head. After class, as students filed out, she paused at the door, did not turn around, said quietly enough that only Claire could hear, "Ask for another homeroom." Then she was gone. Claire watched the empty doorway for a moment, then she wrote it down. The first week passed the way first weeks pass when you are doing 2 things simultaneously, performing one reality for everyone watching while moving carefully through another reality underneath it. On the surface, Claire Donovan was a substitute teacher finding her footing at a new school. She learned which copier was reliable and which one jammed on every 3rd page. She ate lunch in the faculty room and asked appropriate questions about curriculum and classroom management and where the good coffee was. She was friendly without being memorable, present without being intrusive. Underneath that, she was cataloging everything. She noticed the way certain hallways cleared when Tyler Grayson and his 2 closest associates moved through them. Marcus Webb was a senior linebacker, broad across the shoulders, sparse with words. He functioned as enforcement, not in any dramatic way, just in the way a large, loyal presence communicates that it does not need to be asked twice. Cody Harlan was different. Slighter, quicker, with a particular talent for verbal precision, the kind of student who understood exactly how to phrase something so that it landed with full impact while remaining technically deniable. His mother, Catherine Harlan, sat on Westfield Academy's board of directors. She had voted in 3 separate board meetings to approve budget line items that Claire now understood had been used at least in part to fund settlements with people who had decided not to pursue their complaints through official channels. Claire had reviewed all 3 meeting minutes before she walked through the school's front doors. She noticed the way female staff members in the faculty room spoke differently when Warren Grayson's name came up, a slight tightening, a change in register by the careful neutrality that people learn to perform when they have calculated that the cost of honesty is too high. On the 3rd day, she found her lesson planner had been moved from where she had left it on her desk. Not taken, just moved. Placed on the far corner, open to a different page. She looked at it for a moment, then placed it back where it had been open to the same page as before. Someone had been in her classroom during the period it was empty. She adjusted the recording angle of the device under the corner of the desk and said nothing. On the 5th day, she went to find Karen Elliott. She had read about Karen Elliott in the federal file. Not in any formal complaint, Elliott had never filed one. She appeared in an anonymous tip that had initiated the investigation, described only as a female teacher in her late 30s who had left Westfield in the spring, returned the following fall, and had not spoken about the reason for her departure to anyone on staff. Claire found her in the supply room adjacent to the main office, searching for something in a cabinet near the back. Claire asked about social studies curriculum materials. A reasonable question, the kind one teacher asks another without any particular agenda. Elliott answered briefly and efficiently. She did not make eye contact. She moved past Claire toward the door, and Claire thought for a moment that that was all there was going to be. Then Elliott stopped in the doorway. She did not turn around. She said without emphasis, as though commenting on the weather, "This school is not what it looks like." Then she walked away. That evening in the hallway after the last bell, she passed close to Claire in a crowd of exiting faculty and students. Without stopping, without turning her head, she pressed a folded piece of paper into Claire's hand and kept moving. Claire waited until she was alone. Unfolded it. 4 words. Never stay late alone. She held the paper for a long time. Then she photographed it, transmitted it to the federal server, and put it in the inside pocket of her bag. She drove back to her hotel and sat on the edge of the bed for a while without turning on the lights. Karen Elliott was 38 years old and had been teaching at Westfield for 6 years. She had encountered something that had produced a fear specific enough and persistent enough that she still carried it in the way she held her shoulders and the way she left rooms. Claire thought about what that meant. She turned on the lights and got back to work. The first confrontation happened at the end of the second week. It was the confrontation Tyler Grayson had used with at least 3 of the 4 previous substitutes, with variations for taste and circumstance. It had worked every time. The equipment storage room was adjacent to the gymnasium, accessible through a door with a broken lock. Tyler Grayson had a key anyway, coach's son captain's privileges, but the broken lock meant he didn't need it, which meant there was one fewer record of access to explain later. Claire had needed materials for a health class demonstration. This was documented in her lesson plan, filed with the main office the day before. She had gone there during a planning period when her classroom was empty and the hallway outside the gymnasium was quieter than usual. She had known when she walked through that door that there was a reasonable chance Tyler Grayson would follow. She had made a calculation about risk and evidence, and she had walked through the door. He came in 40 seconds later. He positioned himself between her and the exit. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just casually, the way you occupy a space when you want to make clear that you occupy it. He was carrying a folder, some papers, a prop so natural that a passing glance through the small window in the door would see nothing worth noting. He said he'd noticed she'd been having trouble keeping the class's attention. Said he'd been thinking about it. Said he thought maybe she needed to understand the expectations at Westfield a little better. Said he thought they communicated better one-on-one. His voice had the quality of someone who has said a version of this many times and knows which cadences produce which responses. Claire looked at him. She did not back up, did not look toward the door, did not shift her weight in any way that suggested she had found herself in a situation she hadn't anticipated. She said in a voice that was entirely even, "I appreciate the concern. If you have questions about course material, I'm available during posted office hours when other students are present. Please return to wherever you're supposed to be." Tyler Grayson blinked. It was a very small blink, almost imperceptible. But Claire had been watching for it. He said with less certainty than before that he was just trying to help, that this was how things worked at Westfield. She said, "I understand how things work here. Please step back from the door." A pause. 4, maybe 5 seconds. Then Tyler Grayson stepped back and left. Not defeated, not embarrassed. Angry in a way Claire recognized and noted carefully, the anger of someone who has had a script fail for the first time and does not yet understand why, but intends to find out. She stood alone in the storage room for a moment after he left. She touched the recording device on her lapel very lightly and allowed herself one quiet exhale. She thought he will not try that version again. She thought the next version will be designed for an audience. She noted the time. She noted his exact words. She transmitted the recording to the federal server with a timestamp and a brief notation. First direct confrontation, subject escalating toward public venue monitor for next move. Then she gathered the materials she had come for and walked back to her classroom. That night in room 214 of a mid-range business hotel 4 miles from Westfield Academy, Claire removed a device from a false bottom in her rolling suitcase. She connected it to her phone and waited for the confirmation sequence. When it completed, she opened a communication channel and waited. Her sister answered on the second ring. Nicole Donovan was 32 years old and had been an assistant United States attorney in the Civil Rights Division for 4 years. She had their father's directness and their mother's patience, a combination that made her, in the considered opinion of several senior prosecutors, one of the more effective civil rights attorneys in the federal system. She looked tired on the screen. She had been working late on a case that wasn't this one. She always had a case that wasn't this one. She said, "Tell me." Claire told her about the storage room. She recounted it precisely in the order it happened, without editorializing the way their father had taught both of them. "Here is what happened. Here is what was said. Here is what I observed that was not said. Conclusions come after." Nicole listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We have enough for a civil case. The 17 complaints, the settlement payments, the Memphis records. Claire, honestly, we could file tomorrow and have a reasonable case." Claire said nothing. Nicole said, Claire said, "But a civil case gets settled. It gets negotiated down to a consent decree that changes the letterhead and nothing else. Voss files retirement paperwork 3 months early, and Warren Grayson gets another transfer to another school in another state, And in 4 years, there's another Elliot, another Caldwell. Nicole was quiet. Claire said, I need criminal conduct in a public setting with unimpeachable witnesses. I need something that can't be sealed, can't be negotiated, can't be explained away. I need them to do it in front of people who will never stop seeing it. Nicole looked at her for a long moment. She said, you know what you're asking to let happen? I know. You're 24 years old. I know what I'm doing. Another pause, a different kind. Then Nicole said, all assets are in preliminary position. FBI Civil Rights Division has an active monitoring feed on the school's external communications. If you activate the emergency biometric protocol, response time is under 8 minutes. She paused. Dad knows you're close to the end of it. He asked me to tell you he reads everything you transmit, every file, every recording, every morning before court. Claire looked at the screen. She said, I know. After she ended the call, she sat for a while with the lights on. She was thinking about a dinner table, a specific dinner table in a house in Alexandria, Virginia when she was 16 years old. Her father had come home from a hearing in a case she had been following in the newspaper. A teacher in Tennessee, a school administration that had covered for 3 years what should have been reported in 3 days. A woman who had lost her job and her health and eventually her marriage to what the system had insisted on calling a misunderstanding. Her father had sat down at the table and said almost nothing during dinner. Afterward, when her mother had gone to answer a phone call, he had looked at Claire across the table and said, she did everything right, every step. She went through every channel, and the channels protected the people who built them. Claire had asked, then what do you do? He had been quiet for a long time. Then he said, you build a better channel. She had been 24 years old for 3 months. She had a career in federal civil rights law, essentially guaranteed a future that people had been pointing to for years as the natural result of talent and preparation and the right family name. None of that was why she was sitting in this hotel room. She was sitting in this hotel room because of Lily Caldwell, who was 16 years old and had submitted a 3-page handwritten complaint and had been told by an adult in a position of authority that it was complicated and to consider whether she might have misunderstood and to think about what an accusation might mean for everyone involved. She was sitting in this hotel room because of Karen Elliott, who was 38 years old and had made a decision she would never stop paying for, and who had pressed a folded piece of paper into a stranger's hand in a hallway and kept walking. She was sitting in this hotel room because her father had spent his career building cases that went through channels, and the channels had given men like Warren Grayson clean transfers and fresh starts, and she intended to close that particular door for good. She turned off the lights. She set the alarm for 6:15. She did not sleep for a long time. The second week moved differently than the first. The harassment escalated, but carefully, each step small enough to maintain plausible deniability, each step designed to accumulate pressure rather than create a single obvious incident. Tyler Grayson did not return to the direct approach. Instead, he began a campaign that was ambient rather than confrontational, standing too close during classroom discussions, turning small moments into demonstrations for the audience of the class that Claire Donovan was a person whose space could be entered whenever the mood struck. Marcus Webb began showing up near the door of her classroom during passing periods, not doing anything, just present watching. Cody Harlan deployed his gift for the turn phrase, the comment that landed at exactly the intersection of compliment and diminishment, the observation that made a room half laugh and left its target with no clean response. He used this twice in the second week, both times in front of sufficient witnesses. None of it was actionable on its own. That was the architecture of it. Each piece examined in isolation was defensible. It was the pattern that told the story, and patterns require documentation before they constitute evidence, and documentation requires someone with the training to know what they're looking at. Claire had that training. She noted everything. She transmitted everything. She said nothing. On the 7th day of the second week, Principal Sandra Voss called her in. Voss was a careful woman, careful in the way that people who have made a series of choices they would rather not examine too closely become careful. She had been principal at Westfield for 5 years. She had never in 5 years allowed a formal harassment complaint to proceed past her desk to any external authority. This was not something she advertised. It was a consistent pattern documented in the federal file across 17 separate incidents whose probability of being accidental was effectively zero. She offered Claire coffee. She expressed genuine seeming warmth. She asked how the placement was going and whether Claire felt supported. Then she said gently that she'd heard about a small misunderstanding in the equipment storage area the previous week. Said these things happen in a school with strong student culture. Said she hoped Claire understood that Westfield had its own way of handling these situations internally, and that it tended to work better when everyone stayed within the school community rather than escalating things unnecessarily. She smiled when she said it. Claire smiled back. She said she appreciated the guidance and would keep it in mind. She had been recording since she walked through the door. On the 14th evening of her placement, Karen Elliott knocked on the door of the empty classroom where Claire was working late. The knock was tentative, then firmer. Claire opened the door. Elliott looked different than she did in the hallways. In the hallways, she maintained the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. In the doorway, she looked like someone who had made a decision and was committed to living with it. She said, "I know you're not just a substitute." Claire said nothing. Elliot said, "I don't know who you are or who sent you. I don't need to know. What I need to tell you is that 3 years ago, a student in Coach Grayson's program cornered me in the parking structure after a late faculty meeting. I reported it formally. I documented everything. I went through every proper channel." She paused. 6 days after I filed the complaint, a man I'd never met came to my home address with an envelope. The envelope contained a settlement agreement and a check for $40,000. The check was drawn on an account belonging to something called the Westfield Community Development Fund. I was told that the alternative to signing is a formal review of my teaching performance, which would likely result in my contract not being renewed. She looked at Claire directly. "I signed it. I have hated myself for it every single day since." She said, "If there is a way for me to be useful as a witness in any capacity, I want to do that. Before someone else ends up making the same calculation I made." Claire looked at her for a long moment. She thought about all the ways this could complicate the operation, about protocol, about procedure. Then she thought about Karen Elliott driving home with a check in an envelope, doing the math in a parking lot, making the only choice that felt survivable at the time. She said, "Tell me exactly what happened. From the beginning. I need dates times every name you remember." Elliot sat down. She started talking. Outside, the Charlotte night moved through the windows of the empty classroom, the distant sound of traffic, the amber quality of southern September darkness, the kind of night that remembers summer without quite being summer anymore. In 11 days, there would be a monthly all-school assembly in the Westfield Academy gymnasium. Tyler Grayson had been planning it for a week. He had not told his father. And Claire Donovan, sitting across from Karen Elliott in the empty classroom, listening carefully to every word, was already thinking 3 steps past where Tyler Grayson thought the board was. She had come to Westfield Academy to document a pattern. She was about to give that pattern a face. Part 2. The cracks beneath. Karen Elliott talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Claire did not interrupt. She had learned from her father that the most valuable testimony comes from silence, from the quality of listening that communicates to a person that what they are saying matters, that it is being received with full weight, that they are not talking into a room that will absorb their words and make them disappear the way rooms at Westfield Academy had been absorbing words for nearly a decade. Elliott was precise. She had the precision of someone who had rehearsed this accounting in private many times without an audience, who had gone over the details so many times in the dark that they had become a kind of liturgy. The date, the parking structure, the exact wording of the settlement agreement, the name of the man who had come to her home address, the figure on the check, the language of the clause that required her silence toward any external authority. She remembered all of it. When she finished, she looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Claire. She said, "There was another teacher, the year before me. I don't know her name. I heard about her secondhand from a custodian who had worked here since the school opened. She filed a complaint and then she was gone. No explanation, no forwarding address through the school. She left in the middle of a semester." Claire noted this. She said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Do you believe Warren Grayson knew about the settlement, about the fund that paid it?" Elliot did not hesitate. He suggested it, not directly, but the man who came to my house when he explained the arrangement, he mentioned that Coach Grayson valued loyalty from his staff, that the school took care of people who understood how things worked. She paused. It was framed as a kindness. They had practiced making it sound like they were doing me a favor. Claire drove back to her hotel that night, thinking about the word loyalty, the way it gets used by men who have accumulated power within institutions, how it functions as both promise and threat simultaneously. How it means when you translate it into plain language. This arrangement works for me, and I will make it work for you, provided you understand that the arrangement is permanent and my interests take precedence. Warren Grayson had been practicing loyalty for a long time. She was about to show him what it looked like from the outside. The third week began with the quiet that in Claire's experience preceded escalation rather than resolution. Tyler Grayson pulled back from the direct pressure, still watchful, but the ambient campaign of the second week had shifted into something more subdued. He was letting the institution do the work, testing whether Voss's quiet conversation with Claire had produced the desired effect. It hadn't, but Claire was careful not to let that show. She continued arriving at 7:15. She continued eating lunch in the faculty room. She continued performing the mild conscientious uncertainty of a young teacher finding her footing, and she continued noting, recording, and transmitting everything beneath that surface. On the Tuesday of the third week, she accessed the school's internal document management system. This requires some explanation. 8 months before Claire walked into Westfield Academy's parking lot, a compliance attorney at the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights had received an anonymous tip through the department's secure reporting portal. The tip described a pattern of harassment complaints at a charter school in Charlotte, North Carolina, systematically suppressed by school administration over a period of several years. The tip included partial documentation enough to suggest the pattern was real, not enough to constitute actionable evidence on its own. The compliance attorney had escalated it to Nicole's division on the basis of potential Title IX and civil rights violations. Nicole's team had spent 4 months building the preliminary case. They had obtained financial records through legitimate federal channels. They had reviewed public board meeting minutes. They had interviewed 3 former students who had agreed to speak without attribution. What they had was a civil case strong in outline, fragile in specifics. The settlements had been structured carefully. The complaint files had been managed carefully. The paper trail existed, but existed in ways that could be argued around, explained, contextualized by a competent defense attorney as administrative decisions rather than deliberate suppression. What they needed was the primary source material, the actual complaint files, the actual settlement agreements, the actual communications between Grayson and Voss and the board members who had approved payments they described in meeting minutes as facility maintenance expenses. A federal magistrate had signed an order authorizing limited access to the school's internal document management system for the purpose of a civil rights investigation. The order was narrow, specific, and filed under seal. Claire had been authorized to execute it. She did so on Tuesday morning during a free period, sitting at the teacher's workstation in her locked classroom, using a secure connection routed through a VPN and invisible to the school's network administrators. She found the complaints folder within 11 minutes. It had been named in the dark administrative humor of someone who had been doing something wrong long enough that it stopped feeling wrong. Community feedback resolved. There were 17 files. She opened the first one, read it, opened the second, the third. By the fourth, she had stopped noting specific contents and begun noting the pattern, the consistency of Voss's responses, the formulaic language, the framing that appeared in nearly every file. The situation had been reviewed carefully and determined to fall within the range of normal student conduct, and the administration was confident the matter had been addressed appropriately. 14 of the 17 complaints involved players on the football team. 9 involved players active on the roster during seasons Warren Grayson had coached. 3 predated Grayson's arrival. Those had been handled differently, resolved through legitimate internal processes, documented transparently, with appropriate follow-up. The contrast was not subtle. She found the Memphis file embedded in a subdirectory that appeared to be a backup of administrative correspondence from the previous superintendent's tenure. The file was fragments, a letter from a school board attorney in Tennessee, portions of a mutual separation agreement, a single email chain that had been partially deleted but not fully purged from the backup system. The email chain was between the previous superintendent and a board member. The relevant section was 4 lines. The board member had written, "The situation in Memphis was resolved without formal findings. His record is clean for transfer purposes. We have an opportunity to bring in a proven program builder, and I think we'd be making a mistake to let one unsubstantiated complaint from a staff member derail that." The previous superintendent had replied, "Agreed, the coaching results speak for themselves. I'll finalize the offer." That was it. 4 lines, 8 years ago. Claire transmitted the entire archive to Nicole's secure server and then sat quietly for a moment. She thought about the word unsubstantiated. She thought about what it takes to make a complaint unsubstantiated. What institutional machinery has to be in motion quietly and continuously to ensure that the right complaints are never substantiated? to ensure that the women who bring those complaints are encouraged gently and firmly to understand that they have misread a situation, to ensure that when a man moves from one school to another, he carries nothing with him but the winds. She transmitted a brief note to Nicole alongside the archive. The system didn't hide one bad man, it relocated him. Nicole's response came back within 3 minutes. I've been saying this for 4 years. Now we can prove it. On Thursday of the third week, Warren Grayson called Tyler into his office. Claire did not witness this directly. She reconstructed it afterward from Tyler's behavior over the following days, from a fragment of audio captured by a monitoring device placed with federal authorization in the hallway outside the coaching staff offices, and from what Tyler himself would eventually say under oath. The conversation was brief. Grayson had spent 23 years reading situations, and the situation with the substitute teacher had been reading wrong for nearly 3 weeks. Not because he knew who Claire Donovan really was, but because he had built his operation on an acute sensitivity to threat, and something about this particular teacher produced a low-level signal he couldn't dismiss. She didn't leave. Every teacher before her had left or could be made to leave within 2 weeks, and she carried herself in a way that was slightly wrong for the part she was supposed to be playing, a composure too consistent, a reaction time too calibrated, an absence of the social anxiety that genuine 24-year-old substitute teachers carry like weather. He told Tyler to stand down. Stand down, the language of a man who thought in terms of campaigns and tactical patience. Tyler said he understood. He did not say that he had already spoken to Marcus Webb and Cody Harlan about the all-school assembly in 11 days. That he had already decided independent of his father's judgment and in some ways in explicit defiance of it, that the situation required a public resolution, the kind that sent a message so clear and so witnessed that no one at Westfield Academy would require it to be repeated. He said, "Yes, sir." Then he walked out. For 3 days, nothing happened. This was harder than the pressure in a way Claire had not entirely anticipated. The pressure had been workable, something to move through, something that produced evidence, something with a forward direction. The silence had a different quality. It made the edges of the plan feel less certain. She kept her transmissions to Nicole factual and brief. On the second quiet evening, sitting in the hotel room, with the secure connection open and a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside her, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Grayson had succeeded, that, through administrative machinery, rather than confrontation, the situation would be resolved in his favor, and she would be asked politely but unmistakably to conclude the placement. Nicole, reading her transmissions with the attention of someone who had known her for 24 years, sent a single line, "You're thinking about the exit. Stop thinking about the exit." Claire looked at that line for a while. She thought about Lily Caldwell's file, about the specific language of Voss's response to a 16-year-old who had come in on a Tuesday afternoon with a 3-page complaint written in careful cursive and had been told that these things were complicated and she should think about what an accusation might mean for everyone involved. She closed the transmission window and went to sleep. On the 4th day, everything resumed. What happened between Tyler Grayson and Devin Marsh was never intended to be part of the record. It happened in a part of the school with no relevance to the investigation between two people, only one of whom was a subject of federal surveillance. Claire learned about it afterward in pieces from sources she assembled carefully. But it matters. It matters in the way that the things we don't intend to reveal matter most. Devin Marsh was 17 years old and had been at Westfield for 3 years. He was in the art program, tolerated, occasionally cited in grant applications as evidence of the school's breadth, but largely invisible to the power structure that organized daily life. He was slight quiet in the way of people who have learned that their observations are more valuable than their declarations, and he was in a context where almost no one was genuinely honest with Tyler Grayson. They had been friends since 9th grade, a friendship that existed mainly in the margins, in the 10 minutes between classes when Tyler was moving between worlds. Devin did not attend games. He did not perform the rituals of football adjacency that characterized most relationships in Tyler's orbit. He simply showed up occasionally and said what he thought. This had made him, without either of them quite articulating it, the most important person in Tyler Grayson's life. On a Wednesday evening of the 3rd week, they were in the art room after hours. Devin had a project due. Tyler had been avoiding his house. Warren Grayson's silences when he was managing a situation had a weight that filled rooms and required distance to breathe around. Devin was working. Tyler was sitting on the table near the window, not doing anything in particular. Devin said without looking up from his work, "The new teacher, Miss Donovan." Tyler said nothing. Devin said, "What are you planning?" Tyler said he didn't know what he was talking about. Devin said, "Tyler." One word, just the name. With the weight a name carries when someone uses it to mean I know you and I know the shape of what you're about to do, and I am asking you not to. Tyler was quiet for a while. Then he said in a register quieter than his normal one, with something in it he wouldn't have let anyone else in the building hear. My father says this is how the world works. You establish authority early. People function better when they understand the hierarchy. Devin set down what he was working on. He said, "Your father isn't the world." 4 words, simple, declarative, completely without drama. Tyler did not respond. He looked at the window for a long time. Then he stood up, said something neutral about the time and left. There is a version of this moment in which those 4 words landed somewhere useful in time to change something. That version did not happen. What Tyler took from that conversation was not the question Devin had asked. What he took was the silence that preceded his answer, the pause in which he had almost said something true about himself and hadn't, and knew he hadn't, and understood that the gap between the truth he'd almost said and the answer he gave was now something he had to fill with action. He was in the athletic director's office before 8 the next morning, confirming his role in the all-school assembly program. 6 days before the assembly, Lily Caldwell waited for Claire outside the classroom after the morning session. She was doing it with the careful casualness of someone who had learned to do everything important and carefully appearing to look at her phone standing where Claire would have to pass within 3 feet of her. As Claire passed, Lily held a small folded piece of paper at her side without looking up. Claire took it with the same naturalness. A motion over in less than a second. Invisible at any distance. She read it in the faculty restroom with the door locked. A single line written in the same careful hand as the complaint submitted 14 months ago. "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." Claire stood at the sink and looked at the paper. She thought about 14 months, about the ongoing weight of carrying something like this, not the acute moment, but the daily restructuring of a person's life. How a 16-year-old learns to calculate proximity to exits. How she learns to take longer routes. How she stops thinking of this as unusual because by month 3, it has become ordinary. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her bag. She transmitted a brief note to Nicole. "Witness 2 confirmed, voluntary, unsolicited. Assembly is 6 days out. Keep response teams in position." Then she unlocked the door and went back to work. The assembly was scheduled for the morning of September 28th. Claire arrived at 6:45. She parked in the far corner of the lot, the same space she had used every morning for 4 weeks, and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. She performed a systematic check of every recording device, the 3 concealed units, the biometric monitor, the phone. She verified the transmission connection to Nicole's secure server. She sent a brief status note, "All systems active, assembly at 9 standing by." Nicole's response, "All assets in final position, FBI Civil Rights Division, active monitoring. Federal marshals briefed and standing by. Response time under 8 minutes from your activation signal. Execute when ready." A second message a few seconds later, "Dad called last night. He said to tell you he's proud of you. He also said don't do anything he wouldn't do." I reminded him that covers very little. Claire read both messages twice. Then she got out of the car and walked toward the school. The gymnasium at Westfield Academy held the student body and the bleachers on either side faculty, along the wall at the far end, administrative staff near the podium at center court. The LED screen on the back wall displayed the school seal on a rotating background. The school's social media accounts manager had his camera set up on a tripod near the door. The monthly assembly was a tradition Warren Grayson had instituted in his second year. Before his arrival, assemblies had been quarterly and primarily administrative. He had established the monthly format and the specific structure, recognition of athletic achievements, character-building remarks from coaching staff, a community segment that reinforced what he called the Westfield family. The language of family. It is worth pausing on this. Institutions that operate the way Westfield Academy operated depend on the language of family more than almost anything else. Family language accomplishes 2 things simultaneously. It creates genuine loyalty and warmth among the people it includes, and there was real loyalty at Westfield, real community, real affection between students and teachers who cared deeply about the work. Those things were true. They made the institution look exactly like what it claimed to be. But family language also creates a framework in which certain kinds of behavior become private matters. Internal disputes, things handled at home rather than taken outside. It converts institutional crimes into family problems. It makes the person who goes to external authorities into the one who has violated the family rather than the institution. Warren Grayson had been speaking this language for 15 years. Claire took her position along the faculty wall at 8:58 and stood with her hands at her sides. She could feel the biometric monitor registering her pulse, which was elevated but controlled. She had trained herself across 4 weeks to manage physiological responses that would have been natural, the discipline of performing calm when the body is preparing for impact. Principal Voss opened proceedings at 9:03. Administrative announcements, the recognition segment, which ran approximately 7 minutes. And then she said it was time for roll call. Claire heard the shift in the gymnasium before she saw it. The shift that happens when the people who know something is coming have prepared for it, and the people who don't are picking up on the preparation without understanding it. The bleachers on the left side produced a directed waiting quality of attention. Tyler Grayson was already moving. She could see him at the edge of her peripheral vision, angling toward the faculty section with the deliberate, casual movement of someone who has choreographed an approach to look spontaneous. Marcus Webb had positioned himself to Claire's left. Cody Harlan was to her right. The geometry of it was practiced, efficient, invisible to anyone who understood what they were seeing. Voss continued down the faculty roster. Claire heard her own name called. She said, "Present," clearly without hesitation, the way she had said it every morning for 4 weeks. And Tyler Grayson closed the remaining distance. He said something about her shirt, about professionalism, about helping, about Westfield traditions in the performed audience-directed tone of someone narrating a planned action for maximum effect. The words registered but were not the point. The words were the frame. The action was the point. He grabbed the collar of her blouse with both hands. He pulled. The sound of fabric tearing moved across the gymnasium from center court to the back wall and returned. Then silence. Not a transitional silence. A held silence, the silence of a crowd that has collectively witnessed something and is collectively trying to process it, trying to locate it in a familiar category, trying to find the frame that makes it make sense. Some students had phones out, recording. Tyler Grayson was laughing. 2 of his teammates were laughing. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. The laughter was the worst part because it confirmed what the silence suspected. That this had happened here before, in some form many times, and nothing had stopped it. And the institution assembled in this room had looked at its own behavior and decided over and over that the cost of stopping it was higher than the peace of allowing it. That was what those seconds contained. Not just an assault, the entire weight of 17 complaint files, of Karen Elliott's $40,000 check, of Lily Caldwell's 14 months of sitting at the back of a classroom with her head down, of the woman who had left in the middle of a semester, of the Memphis transfer in the clean record, and those 4 lines in an email that had relocated a problem rather than resolved it. All of it present in that gymnasium. Claire stood in the center of it. She had not moved. She was not going to move. Part 3, The Reckoning. Agent Laura Sinclair had been with the FBI's Civil Rights Division for 11 years. She had walked into a lot of rooms. She came through the gymnasium door at 9:17 and crossed the floor toward the center without hurry, the movement of someone who has done the difficult work and is now arriving at its conclusion. The room she entered was not chaos. It was something more unsettling than chaos, a crowd standing in the stillness of people who have witnessed something and have not yet decided what to do with having witnessed it. She looked at Claire Donovan, who was still standing exactly where she had been, who had not moved, whose expression showed something more complicated than distress, the look of someone who has arrived after a very long journey at exactly the place they intended to be. Sinclair said, "Miss Donovan." Claire said, "That's me. Everything has been transmitted. Tyler Grayson is directly in front of me. Marcus Webb and Cody Harlan are approximately 15 feet to either side. Warren Grayson should be in his office in the administrative wing. He's been there since 8 this morning." Sinclair nodded once and turned to Tyler Grayson. She said his name. She said the charges. She said the words that are required by law, words said so many times in so many rooms that they have taken on a rhythm that belies the weight of what they mean. The right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the acknowledgement that anything said could be used in a court of law. Tyler Grayson's legs did not go out from under him. He had been raised to stand straight under pressure, to project control, to never let the opposition read your position in your posture. His father had taught him that, but his face changed. It changed in the way that faces change when a person encounters for the first time in their life a situation their understanding of the world did not contain. He had a model for how power worked. He had been given that model carefully and consistently, by someone he trusted completely. The model did not include this room. He said, "You set this up." His voice reached for solid ground and didn't find it. "This whole thing was a setup." Claire looked at him. She said, "You've had 23 opportunities in 4 weeks to make a different choice. 17 of them were recorded. You made the same choice every time." She paused. "What happened in this gymnasium this morning was your choice, Tyler, not mine. I documented it. There's a difference, Abraham." He looked at the screen on the back wall. The school seal was gone. In its place was the equipment storage room 2 weeks earlier. The date stamp in the lower corner was precise. The audio was clear enough that Tyler Grayson's voice saying what he had said in that room was recognizable to every person in the gymnasium who had ever heard him speak. This was the protocol Nicole had spent 2 weeks designing and Claire had authorized on the morning of the 7th day. Triggered automatically when Claire's biometric monitor registered an attack-level stress threshold. The feed cycled through the full evidentiary record in Nicole's carefully arranged sequence. The storage room, the 17 complaint files, the settlement payment records, the board meeting minutes, with line items that didn't correspond to any facility work. Anyone could locate the email chain from Memphis. The names, the approving signatures. In the section of bleachers where parents sat who had come in early for the assembly, Catherine Harlan looked at the screen and saw her own name in the column marked approving signature. She did not move. She sat very still, the way people sit when the floor has shifted and they are not yet sure how far. Claire reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She withdrew a credential wallet and held it open. She said, "My name is Claire Donovan. My father is Judge Robert Donovan of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals of the United States. I have been conducting an authorized civil rights investigation at this institution for the past 4 weeks, and I hear sirens outside." The gymnasium was completely still. Then from the parking lot, sirens, growing louder. The agent behind Tyler moved, and the handcuffs came out, and the sound they made, small, metallic, precise, moved across that gymnasium, in the same way the other sound had moved 40 seconds earlier, but carrying an entirely different weight. Marcus Webb said nothing when they separated him from the group. He stood where he was told to stand and looked at a point on the gymnasium wall and waited. Cody Harlan said that his mother was a board member and there were going to be serious conversations at a serious level. He said this in a voice that had lost all its precision. The careful landed quality that had always been his instrument was gone, replaced by what it actually was, a 17-year-old boy discovering that the name he had relied on his entire life was currently on a federal evidence screen in connection with payments made to silence people his school had harmed. Sinclair looked at him with the patience of someone who has heard this argument many times. She said, "You'll have the opportunity to discuss that with your attorney." While this was happening in the gymnasium, 2 floors up and at the far end of the administrative wing, Warren Grayson was sitting at his desk reviewing practice film on his laptop. He did not yet know. This is the thing about carefully constructed worlds. They insulate the people inside them very effectively right up to the moment they don't. He had told Tyler to stand down. He had not anticipated that Tyler would decide at 17 years old with his father's confidence and none of his father's patience that standing down was not the lesson he had learned. The agents who came through his office door at 9:19 had a federal warrant. They had, in addition to charges related to the active investigation, a supplementary warrant for his computer, his files, and his communication records going back 4 years. Warren Grayson read the warrant carefully. He understood legal documents. He could tell the difference between one with procedural problems and one without. He read it and understood it was without problems. And then he made the decision that would define the remainder of his life, not the decision to fight, not the decision to invoke his rights and wait for counsel, but the other decision, the one that came from somewhere in his character that had always prioritized his own continuity above everything else. He said, "I want to cooperate." He said, "My son acted without my authorization. I told him specifically not to escalate the situation. He made an independent decision. I had no knowledge of his plans for this morning." He said it clearly, in the tone of a reasonable man making a factual clarification. The way he had said many things over the years, carefully arranged language designed to place him on the correct side of a line. The agents listened. One of them was recording. None of this was going to help Warren Grayson in the ways he imagined. The federal case against him was not primarily about this morning. It was about 17 complaint files, 8 years of deliberate suppression, a $40,000 check, and 4 lines in an email from Memphis that said, "His record is clean for transfer purposes." This morning was the capstone, not the foundation. The foundation had been assembled for 8 months by Nicole Donovan's team, and a federal magistrate who had read the preliminary file and signed the access order without hesitation. Warren Grayson did not know the full shape of what had been built against him. He was working with the information he had, and he said what he said. It was recorded. One floor below in the corridor outside the gymnasium, a radio on an agent's belt carried a fragment of audio, a man's voice recognizable to anyone who had ever heard it across a practice field or in a school hallway saying, "He acted without my authorization. I had no knowledge." Tyler Grayson was standing within a few feet of it. He heard his father's voice say those words. He stood in the corridor of Westfield Academy with federal handcuffs on his wrists and the gymnasium behind him. And he heard the man who had built the entire world Tyler inhabited, who had provided every framework Tyler possessed for understanding power and loyalty and what it meant to be protected. He heard that man at the moment that mattered most, place distance between them with the efficiency of a practice technician. There are things that break people in obvious ways. There are things that break people in ways that don't show until later, that move through a person like a slow structural failure, invisible on the surface until the surface can no longer hold. Tyler Grayson's face showed neither. It showed something simpler and more total than either. It showed a person encountering the complete collapse of the only story they had ever been told about themselves. He did not cry. He did not speak. He stood in the corridor and looked at a point on the wall, and the point he was looking at was approximately where Devin Marsh was standing. Devin had not moved from his position during any of what had happened. He was standing with his hands at his sides, watching, not recording on his phone, not leaning toward the person next to him to say something, just watching in the way he had always watched, with the attention of someone who understands that the most important thing in certain moments is to be fully present without making them about yourself. Tyler looked at him. Devin looked back. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that the looking didn't already contain. Devin's face did not carry triumph or vindication or the satisfaction of a person who has watched someone finally receive confirmation they should have listened. It carried something quieter and harder than any of those things. It carried grief. The grief of someone who has watched a person they care about arrive through a series of choices accumulating over years at the only place those choices could lead. Tyler turned his face away. He did not look back. Principal Sandra Voss had been sitting in the administrative section near the podium when the agents came in. She watched the screen cycle through the documents with an expression that moved over approximately 90 seconds through confusion, then comprehension, then the executive calculation of a person running numbers and finding no version that works. She was approached by an agent who introduced himself quietly, showed credentials, and asked if she would come with him to the administrative offices. Voss said in a voice that was carefully controlled but visibly effortful, "I want to call my attorney." The agent said that was absolutely her right. They walked together through the gymnasium and out the side door, and the students and faculty who watched them go did so in the silence of people revising their understanding of a place they thought they knew. Sinclair crossed to where Claire was standing along the faculty wall. She assessed Claire's condition with the brief, practiced efficiency of someone who conducts welfare checks professionally. She asked if Claire needed medical attention. Claire said no. Sinclair said, "I want you to know that your transmission record is complete. Every recording, every timestamp, every document. It's the cleanest undercover civil rights file I've seen in 11 years. Your sister built the legal architecture. But you built this." Claire looked at the gymnasium, at the students still there, some of them talking to each other, some looking at the screen, which had gone dark when Nicole closed the broadcast, some looking at Claire. She said, "There are 17 families who submitted complaints to this school over 8 years and were told their complaints had been resolved. They need to be contacted individually by people who understand victim notification protocol before the press gets the full story." Sinclair said, "That's already in motion. Nicole's team started the outreach list 2 hours ago." Claire nodded. She said, "And the Memphis families. Whatever happened there, there are people who were never given this kind of accounting. They deserve it." Sinclair said, "That file is open. It has been since Tuesday." Claire looked at the torn fabric of her blouse, which she had been holding together with one hand since the moment Tyler Grayson had pulled. She looked at it the way a person looks at physical evidence of something, not with distress, but with the attention of someone cataloging a fact. The fact of it, what it meant, what it had cost. Then she adjusted her jacket over it and turned back to the room. Nicole arrived at Westfield Academy at 10:43. She came through the gymnasium side door and found Claire in the corridor outside, sitting on a bench, making notes on a legal pad with the focused efficiency of someone using work to metabolize adrenaline. Claire looked up. Nicole sat down next to her. They did not embrace immediately. This was not coldness. It was the way people move when they have been working alongside each other through something serious, the instinct to stay in operational mode until it is no longer necessary because dropping out too early makes the transition harder. Nicole said, "Whitfield is already at the detention facility." Grayson's attorney. Claire said, "Of course he is." Nicole said, "He's going to argue the investigation was improper. Entrapment. That you created the conditions for the assault." Claire said Tyler Grayson created the conditions for the assault across 4 weeks and at least 7 prior documented incidents. Whitfield has seen the file by now. He knows what he has. Nicole said he knows what he has. A pause. Then Nicole said her sister's name, quietly. Not the lawyer's version of it, the other version, the one that had been waiting underneath everything else for 4 weeks of operation and months of preparation before it, and years of conversations about systems and channels and the cost of being right. Claire looked at her. Nicole said, "Are you actually okay?" It was not a lawyer's question. Claire was quiet for a moment. She said, "Ask me in a week." Nicole looked at her for a moment. Then she put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they sat on the bench in the corridor of Westfield Academy and said nothing for a while, which was the most honest thing either of them could have offered. The legal proceedings that followed moved with the deliberate speed of federal law, which is to say slowly by any standard except the standard of institutions that have been operating without accountability for 8 years, to which any movement feels swift. Warren Grayson was charged with conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of authority, obstruction of justice, and abuse of institutional power. The charges were specific, documented, and backed by a file that his attorney, Greg Whitfield, reviewed in full and described to a colleague in a private communication that later became part of the public record as the most thoroughly constructed civil rights case at the state level he had seen in 20 years. The entrapment argument was raised and dismissed at the preliminary hearing. The judge reviewed the evidence and noted in language later quoted in legal journals that there is no entrapment defense available to a pattern of behavior predating the investigator's presence by 8 years. Whitfield stood outside the federal courthouse and told the assembled press that his client had cooperated fully and that the true responsibility for September 28th rested with those who had orchestrated the operation. He used words like overreach. He mentioned the 3 state championships. The reporters listened. They wrote it down. They also wrote down the 17 complaint files, the settlement payments, the Memphis transfer, and the email that said, "His record is clean." The 3 state championships appeared in very few of the final stories. Tyler Grayson's case was handled in the federal juvenile system. The proceedings were not public. The outcome, made public at the request of several victims through a formal notification process, included a period of confinement, mandatory accountability programming, and a registration requirement that would follow him for years. At his sentencing, through his attorney, he submitted a written statement. It was 2 paragraphs. The first accepted full responsibility for his actions. The second stated that he understood his actions had caused harm that could not be undone, and that he intended to spend his life trying to understand why he had made the choices he had made. He did not mention his father. Sandra Voss surrendered her teaching certificate as part of a negotiated agreement with the state licensing board and federal prosecutors. This produced among the victims, whose complaints she had suppressed, responses that ranged from acceptance to grief to a particular kind of anger, the kind that comes from watching institutional accountability fall just short of satisfying, which is where institutional accountability usually falls. The federal oversight agreement that replaced her administration required 5 years of external monitoring and a reporting system designed by Nicole's team. Karen Elliott received formal recognition from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division for her voluntary cooperation. She was appointed 6 months after the proceedings concluded as the state's first dedicated school civil rights coordinator, a position that had not existed before, created specifically because the Westfield case had demonstrated the need for it. She occupied it with the combination of precision and empathy of someone who has paid personally for the knowledge they are applying. She sent Claire a handwritten note when the appointment was confirmed. 3 sentences. The last one said, "I should have knocked on that door 6 years ago. I'm glad someone knocked on mine." Lily Caldwell was 18 years old when she testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Education and Civil Rights. She had prepared the testimony herself with guidance from Nicole's office and a victim advocate who had worked with her for 5 months. She had revised it 7 times. She had practiced it in front of a mirror, in front of her mother, in front of the victim advocate. On the morning of the hearing, she arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the corridor outside the hearing room with her hands folded in her lap. She testified for 11 minutes. She described in precise and unadorned language what had happened to her at Westfield Academy, what she had reported, what she had been told. What the subsequent 14 months had felt like from the inside, not in dramatic terms, not in the language of a victim performing victimhood for an audience, but in the specific concrete terms of a young woman who had decided that the most useful thing she could offer was accuracy. She described arriving at school every morning and calculating at the door whether today was a day she could sit in certain sections of the cafeteria. She described the particular way she had learned to navigate hallways. She described taking a longer route to 3 of her classes every day for 14 months because the shorter route passed a locker bay where she no longer felt safe, and how the longer route added 7 minutes to every transition, and how she had stopped thinking of this as unusual by month 3 because it had become ordinary. She said, "I am not here because I am still afraid. I am here because other students are. And they need someone who was there to tell you what it actually costs." The subcommittee chamber was quiet when she finished. The chair thanked her. She nodded once, gathered her papers, and walked back to her seat with the bearing of someone who has done something they were afraid of and found on the other side of it that they were still standing. Claire was in the gallery. She had not told Lily she would be there. She had taken a seat in the second row in unremarkable clothing, and she had been there since the hearing opened. She watched Lily testify. When it was over, she sat for a moment while the room shifted around her, staff moving papers, observers, standing the ambient motion of a formal proceeding, transitioning out of session. She did not move with the crowd. She was thinking about a gymnasium in Charlotte, about the sound that had come before the silence, and the silence that had come after, and the seconds she had stood in that silence before she spoke. About what her father had said across a dinner table when she was 16, "You build a better channel." She was thinking about whether a better channel was what she had built, or something more provisional, a single passage cleared through a structure that would work to obstruct again the moment the attention moved elsewhere, that required continuous maintenance, that needed people willing to do this kind of work not once but repeatedly. Not in dramatic gymnasium confrontations, but in the slow, unglamorous work of making accountability more expensive than concealment. She thought about this for a while. Then she noticed the gallery was nearly empty. She stood. She adjusted her jacket, and her hand, moving from the lapel to the collar of her blouse, almost without her deciding to, came to rest for a moment at the place where 7 months earlier, in a gymnasium with every eye in the room watching, the fabric had been pulled apart. It was not a dramatic gesture. There was no one watching to receive it as one. It was private, specific, a brief contact between her fingers and the collar of her shirt. It meant I was there. I remember what it cost. I am still standing. She dropped her hand. She walked out of the hearing room and into the corridor where light came through tall windows and fell across the marble floor in the way it always does in federal buildings, a quality of institutional daylight that is the same in courthouses and hearing rooms and the offices where people decide what the law means and who it protects. She walked through it toward the exit. Outside, the city was doing what cities do on ordinary mornings. She stood on the steps for a moment. She thought about the foundation she was building, the infrastructure for the next investigation and the one after that. She thought about students in schools she had never visited who were currently sitting in classrooms, calculating routes and avoiding hallways and writing complaints in careful cursive that would be received by people who had practiced the art of the sympathetic non-response. She took out her phone. There were 3 messages from Nicole, 2 from her father's clerk and 1 from Karen Elliott. No words, just a photograph. A framed copy of an appointment letter hanging on the wall of a new office, a position that had not existed 8 months ago. Claire looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put the phone in her pocket and started walking. Westfield Academy still stands. If you drove through Charlotte's East Side today and turned onto the street where it sits, you would find a school that looks from the outside largely as it always has. The building is the same. The practice fields are the same. There is new leadership in the administrative wing, new procedures for filing complaints, and an external monitor who comes in quarterly and reviews every file that has been opened and every file that has been closed and asks with the patience of someone who has been given authority and intends to use it why. The families who sent their children here because they believed in what it promised are still watching. Some of them are angry about what was hidden from them. Some of them are something more complicated than angry, the feeling of people who loved an institution that failed them and are not quite ready to stop loving what it could have been. All of them are still there. For those of you who spent decades watching institutions protect the wrong people, who filed a complaint and were told the matter had been appropriately resolved or Watch someone you cared about file a complaint and receive the same answer for those of you who stood in hallways calculating routes and never told anyone why. Does this feel like justice to you? I genuinely like to know.